To the Middle East now. In Gaza, witnesses and officials from the Hamas-run health ministry say Israeli airstrikes and gunfire killed dozens of people on Monday. Almost 30 civilians were reportedly killed when airstrikes hit a crowded seaside café in Gaza City. Witnesses said the café was filled with women and children and described huge explosions shaking the area, quote, like an earthquake, unquote. Palestinians trying to get food aid also came under fire again on Monday, leaving at least 11 people dead, according to witnesses and health officials. While the total death tolls being reported by media outlets vary, the Associated Press says over 70 Palestinians were killed on Monday alone, and Israeli strikes continued well into the night. A large blast was seen in Gaza early Tuesday morning. Well, in Israel, Defense Minister Israel Katz suggested his country's military campaign in Gaza might be nearing an end, despite skepticism from many Palestinians. Let's hear what he had to say.
We are now facing the completion of the Gaza campaign and the achievement of its objectives. First and foremost, the release of all hostages and the defeat of Hamas. There are still many missions to be accomplished on various fronts and much work to be done.
Meanwhile, efforts to achieve a ceasefire in Gaza are being stepped up. Many Israeli media outlets are reporting that Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu will meet U.S. President Donald Trump on July 7th. Ahead of that possible meeting, Israeli officials are already on their way to Washington.
After 20 months of war and misery in Gaza, Donald Trump has decided now is the time for peace.
I think it's close. I just spoke with some of the people involved. We think within the next week we're going to get a ceasefire.
Trump's been pushing that message on his social media platform. Buoyed by the US bombing campaign in Iran and ceasefire there, Gaza is now the focus, with Israel's leader seemingly on the same page.
I want to inform you that many opportunities have now opened up following this victory.
Trump's aim to move beyond previous temporary peace deals to something more permanent. A possible US-Israeli plan has been outlined by the Israeli newspaper Israel Hayom, though some of the points are likely to be contentious. According to the report, which Netanyahu's office contests, Israel says it would end its military action in return for the release of all hostages in Gaza, the exile of Hamas leaders, the running of Gaza by 4 Arab states, likely to include Egypt and the UAE, and the expansion of the Abraham Accords. The original Abraham Accords, signed during Trump's first term in office, normalised relations between Israel and the UAE and Bahrain. An expansion would bring in more Arab countries.
We will welcome Syria, as I said, to the peace and normalization circle in the Middle East, as much as we will welcome the Saudis to join.
Trump may well feel Netanyahu owes him after America's involvement in Iran. The US president has also repeatedly called for Netanyahu's corruption trial to be halted so he can focus on a deal with Gaza, as Trump looks to cement his status as the ultimate peacemaker in the Middle East.
Amnon Aran is a professor of international politics of the Middle East at City University of London, and he has more on the chances of a ceasefire in Gaza.
I think the chances right now are perhaps higher than they were before the war between Israel and Iran. Netanyahu is in a stronger position. President Trump is certainly in a stronger position. But it is also far from a foregone conclusion that this recent endeavor by President Trump will succeed. So higher than before, but not a foregone conclusion yet.
Mm-hmm. On Monday, the Israeli defense minister, we heard him earlier, but just in case, he said, quote, "We're facing the completion of the Gaza campaign." Considering that the goals were to bring all the hostages back home and eradicate Hamas, what do you make of that comment?
Well, I think there is a very large gap between the comment by the defense minister and the actual situation on the ground. It's clear that the Israelis are still very far from achieving their own self-proclaimed goals. As you said, there are still 50 hostages in Israel, amongst them 20 alive and 30 presumed dead. And from what we know, Hamas has still got a very significant presence and is still the most powerful organization on the ground in the Gaza Strip. So the goal to eradicate Hamas militarily and unseat it politically has not been achieved either. The defense minister was referring perhaps to the tactical aims that were presented by the army to the government, but the political goals, i.e. release of the hostages and, quote, eradicating Hamas, unquote, and destroying completely its military capabilities, are still very further away. So none of them have been achieved so far.
That said, how much appetite is there then among the Israeli leadership, especially for the kind of plan Israeli media has been reporting on?
Well, it seems that there is still some appetite in the extreme factions of the Netanyahu government, especially Minister Smotrich, the finance minister, and Minister Itamar Ben-Gvir, to continue the onslaught on the Gaza Strip, to continue the war in the Gaza Strip. As far as they're concerned, probably almost in perpetuity until their ideological goals are reached. They would like to resettle the Gaza Strip. But I think the general appetite in the Israeli public and also crucially in the Israeli government to continue the war in Gaza is decreasing again in comparison to what we've seen in the past. I think the limitations of what Israel can achieve through the use of military force have now become quite evident to the ministers, and this really is reflected also by the changing rhetoric by Prime Minister Netanyahu, who has now elevated the release of the hostages to be the first priority, which is something he has not done in the past.
Mm-hmm. One of the points mentioned in that plan that we saw in the report is the administration of Gaza by other Arab countries. Is that realistic? Are countries like Egypt willing to get involved in that capacity?
Well, at the moment, we do not know of any Arab country that has actually agreed to administer the Gaza Strip. I don't see this as very likely. If it were to happen, this would really be an exchange for something very, very significant that the Egyptians would be receiving. There's also the option of the United Arab Emirates. But at the moment, I must say that I do not see this as a very likely possibility unless it is tied somehow with a master diplomatic stroke, which would include, for example, the expansion of the Abraham Accords, to include perhaps Saudi Arabia, to include some sort of non-aggression agreement between Israel and Syria. Perhaps Arab states could then come out and say that they were able to prevent the Trump plan that he presented earlier on, whereby Palestinians would be, according to the plan, voluntarily transferred from the Gaza Strip to safer areas. Perhaps that would be a pretext that Arab countries could use to become involved. But at the moment, I really see more obstacles than opportunities for Arab states in that happening. The Gaza Strip really needs to be rebuilt. The place is devastated. The financial incurrence would be highly significant, not to mention the political price as well. So at the moment, I would say that there are more obstacles than opportunities for Arab states to become involved.
Amnon Aran, Professor of International Politics, thank you so much for all those insights.
Pleasure.
Let's cross over to Thorsten Schroer. He's the Operations Program Manager at the NGO CADUS International Disaster Response. They have a team operating in Gaza. Thorsten, welcome to DW. What are your colleagues on the ground in Gaza telling you about the situation there?
So the situation in Gaza is still very, very dire. I mean, the total blockade of Gaza since March 2nd has been lifted somewhat, so there are some supplies coming in, but not nearly enough. In addition to that, since the breakdown of the ceasefire mid of March, excessive displacement orders have been issued. So people in Gaza have been again and again displaced, squeezed into ever smaller parts of the Gaza Strip to be somewhat safe. In addition, the implementation or starting of operations of the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, and the new aid distribution scheme puts an additional stress on the population of Gaza.
Your organization has repeatedly protested against exploiting the dire need for humanitarian aid in the Gaza Strip. Now Donald Trump seems to be pushing for a ceasefire. How do you think that could make a difference in terms of aid distribution?
So ceasefire is always the first thing that's needed so that the imminent killing of people stops and that the parties to the conflict can negotiate on how to move further. What is very interesting for us is how a ceasefire deal would actually look like, if that would include unimpeded access of humanitarian aid, but also of private sector supplies into Gaza, and also what that would mean to the extension of the buffer zone, to the access and freedom of movement for humanitarian aid workers, but also for the population. So a ceasefire is very much welcomed and needed, definitely. But there's a lot of questions around what a ceasefire actually would mean.
What do people on the ground need most urgently right now?
Everything. It's a very, very broad question. It sounds like easy to answer, but actually it is not. Gaza is absolutely dependent on importation of goods, of everything. So everything is needed. For sure, it is needed. Safety, security is needed for the people of Gaza to live a dignified life or to start to live a dignified life. But then also importation of like everything is needed. Food is needed, access to medical care, importation of fuel, sanitation, access to water, access to education. It is a very, very broad spectrum, and everything is in dire need in Gaza. Safety, security, food is the actual basis for a dignified life, but it's just a start.
As someone who manages operations in Gaza, I want to ask, in your experience, how common is theft of humanitarian aid, which is Israel's justification for restricting aid to a trickle?
So what I want to say there that even if it would be a large scheme of theft of humanitarian aid, that doesn't justify the starvation of the entire population. In the last year, or almost 1.5 years since CADUS is operating in Gaza, we cannot say that large amounts of humanitarian aid was stolen or diverted to Hamas in the first place. So that's nothing that we can say that it happened. Most of the aid that was brought in through trusted partners, be it the United Nations, be it other aid organizations, actually went directly to the warehouses and was distributed from there. There were incidents of looting. If that was looting by civilians, looting by militants, is hard to say, but for sure it wasn't the majority of the aid.
That was Thorsten Schroer, Operations Program Manager at the NGO CADUS International Disaster Response. Thank you and all the best to your colleagues in Gaza.
Thank you very much for having me on.